Hello, I'm Pat Dennis, and you've tuned into the Theatre of Thrills podcast here on Creative Elk, where I'm going to talk about Scream, not the first one, but the one that came out in 2022, and Scream 6, which is in the cinema right now. There will be spoilers, and that's a pretty big deal in the Scream franchise, because it's basically a murder mystery. You do spend the entire franchise trying to figure out who is the killer behind each film. So if you've not seen it or any of them, fair warning, I'm not going to beat around the bush about who the killers are. And this isn't really a review of any of the films. It's just me giving my thoughts on both them and also the franchise in general, which, weirdly enough, I think is currently simultaneously the strongest and the weakest it's ever been. So let's get down to the nitty-gritty. The franchise did a soft reboot, or as it calls itself in the film, a requel with Scream 2022. Humorously, they titled it Scream, just like Halloween rebooted, calling itself Halloween, with its sequel to Halloween, which was also the start of a trilogy, which technically has 4 parts. It was very confusing, and that's why Scream did the same thing, because Scream is a satire of the slasher genre. So if Halloween does something stupid, you can bet your ass Scream is going to make fun of it. So I really loved it when Scream came out in 2022, just pointing out how annoying the naming of the Halloween sequel trilogy is, and just how much of a clusterfuck that entire franchise is at that point. So the movie came out. It wasn't anything spectacular. It was a darn good movie. It wasn't the best Scream. I would say the original is the best Scream, followed closely by Scream 2. But it was also not the worst Scream, and it was a perfectly enjoyable movie. More importantly than anything else, it actually knew what it was doing. It had something to say, and it specifically said it in the film. It made fun of the fact that Star Wars, Halloween, Ghostbusters, and really every major franchise on the planet has now had a requel, they call it, soft reboot, I call it, where they've done this half-assed reboot of the franchise where they're telling the same story again that they told the first time, but they're also doing it as a follow-up to keep the old fans from rioting, but also drawing in the new fans who are too young to remember it, which is exactly what they did with Scream. They rebooted the franchise with a requel, they brought back legacy characters, but importantly, they were self-aware doing it. They knew that they were doing it to make fun of the fact that other people were doing it, which is how satire works. I completely loved the film when I saw it the first time last year. I did re-watch it recently before going to see the new movie, and it didn't hold up quite as well, but also, as I said at the start of this recording, it's a murder mystery, so of course it's not going to hold up as well the second time because you already know who the killer is. So I was fine with that. They all acted well. Jenna Ortega is great. There were some good killings. It was very well shot. Yada yada yada. Let's get on to Scream 6, the one currently in the cinema at the moment. But first, a minor tangent. Good God, are cinema audiences the worst they've ever been? Me and a friend of mine went to see this movie in the cinema, and we walked out after 10 minutes because there were like 10 kids just climbing over their seats, talking, taking photos with flash photography, which, is really distracting in a dark room and messes with your night vision all through the start of the movie. And we walked out and requested a refund and just asked for tickets to the next session. The manager eventually came over to us and apologized and said that they've now thrown the kids out, and apparently they went in with a parental guardian, but by the time that the manager went in, the parent was gone, and they just threw them out because it's, an M15 plus film and all of them were underage, and they had the gall to request a refund, which is hilarious, and the manager said, no, sod off, so they just lost $120 between them or whatever for being dickheads. But I could not believe how bad an audience they were. Like, what's the point of even paying for movie tickets if you're just going to talk through the entire film and be taking pictures and filming stuff? And I guess this is the generation that hasn't been to the movies much because of COVID. And also they've had their brains melted by endless 3-second TikToks at their disposal for almost all of their lives, so it's not entirely their fault, and also clearly their parental guardian that dropped them there saw that they were misbehaved little shits and then left is definitely to blame. But even the fact that they're not entirely to blame themselves, it was still great to hear they got their comeuppance. There's nothing more enjoyable than hearing that a little shit got their comeuppance. But I digress. After waiting for half an hour or so for the next session, we went in and started the movie again, this time with far less talking, which was great. And I have mixed feelings about this film, which I think might get me a little bit of flack, because it is currently the highest grossing Scream film and it's receiving a lot of love. But even so, what has to be said has to be said. Scream 6 is a good slasher movie, but it is not a great Scream film. It is definitely a film with an identity crisis, and I think Scream as a franchise now probably has one too. They're already planning another one for next year or the year after. Scream 7 is in development, and they're already talking about what actors are going to be in it and whatnot. And I hope they take a long look at what they're doing and think about it. But considering the money's rolling in, I think it's just going to be all steam ahead. Which is fine for slasher fans, but not necessarily great for Scream fans. So let's unpack this and try to figure out what I mean by this. I think, as I said, when Scream 2022 came out, it dropped at the perfect time. Halloween was just releasing its shiny new reboot. It had a goofy name, and it was in the midst of every franchise doing soft reboots. But look at the cinema scope now, and especially the horror area of cinema right now, and think about what you're seeing, because it is not a bad time for horror as a genre. Scream, the franchise, was birthed out of the fact that we were drowning in endless slasher films. You know, there was a million Friday the 13th, there was a million Halloweens. Everyone with a camera was making rip-offs of those films, and even they were getting sequels. So it was the perfect time to make fun of slasher films as an entire subgenre. But now there are no slasher films. Halloween has ended. It ended pretty definitively. Like, I'm sure they will reboot it in a few years' time, as they always do. But until then, it is ended. And even more to the detriment of the Scream franchise, it ended in a really weird and offbeat way. Like, it didn't feel like a Halloween movie. They took major risks. People hated it because of it, but I kind of liked it. But it took major risks, and it wasn't a generic Halloween movie. And Scream as a franchise, as all satires do, is a franchise that thrives when the genre it is satiring has something funny to say about it. And this is an issue that even the makers of Scream recognize. They say it pretty specifically in the movie. The characters do not make fun of bad slasher films like they do in the originals. They talk about how great Jordan Peele is. You know, in the first movie, in Scream 2022 that is, Jenna Ortega's character Tara talks about how much she likes the Babadook. And in this movie they talk about how great Jordan Peele is, and there's a comment even about how the new Candyman is as good as the original Candyman. So even the reboot film, even the rebooted film, is still a really good reboot. And that's a problem, because what are you supposed to make fun of when every major successful horror movie coming out at the moment is both really good and also being well received and generating a pretty good amount of money? There's not much you can make fun of. You know, Hereditary was a bang and done. It doesn't have 50 watered down sequels. Everything A24 does is a bang and done, except for Pearl, which took the series in an entirely different direction and was also just fantastic and should be an awards winner. There's not a cookie cutter factory made production line of generic movies coming out, which is what the Scream franchise was invented to make fun of. And perhaps in what is the highest of ironies, the only cookie cutter factory produced slasher franchise that seems to exist at the moment is Scream. We got one last year, we got one this year, and the next one is already approved and already in the works. So it has kind of become that which it was made to make fun of. I guess it's that saying, you either die the hero or live long enough to see yourself become the villain. Scream is now the generic slasher and kind of the last one in existence. I mean, I've not seen anyone talk about making a new Friday the 13th, and Nightmare on Elm Street has been dead for forever after its failed reboot, and Halloween has just hung up its gloves for the next while. It's only really Scream left, which is ironic to say the least. And I do think they definitely seem to realize this, because the parody has kind of turned inwards now. They're making fun of the Stab movies, which are set in the Scream universe, and talking about what those fictional sequels did for their movies, even though they don't exist and are just a, fictional version of the movie itself. So they're making fun of what happened in Stab 2, which is actually Scream 2 in real life. So it's kind of an interesting way to get around the issue of there not being anything to parody, but it does also feel a little bit like it's eating its own tail. There's not many real life comparisons you can make, because not many still ongoing franchises have lived that long. They're talking about how the sequel to a requel just rehashes what happened in the second film, which I guess Star Wars did for the first maybe 10 minutes of The Last Jedi, but completely then went off in its own tangent after that. That's a whole different mess, but because it went off in its own tangent, that comparison doesn't really hold up there. And Halloween also didn't really follow that suit either. It also went off in a bizarre direction. I mean, I guess both of them featured hospitals heavily, so there's that. But I'm not sure that the comparison exists outside of Scream's own franchise. So it's turned into self-parody, which is a little bit of a shame, but I don't see anywhere else they could have gone with it. And if they want to keep on cranking out more movies, which, it makes money, so why wouldn't you? There's not really anywhere else they could have gone, I guess. But because of that, it's filled with references to Scream 2, which I guess is interesting. It feels a bit like pointless nostalgia. I think South Park summed it up best with the member berries, where it's like, this thing happened, do you remember that? But it doesn't really add anything of substance to the story. So there's a lot of echoing there. For instance, the killer in Scream 6 is the parent of the killer in Scream 5. In Scream 6, it's the dad, but in Scream 2, it's the mum. So once again, you've got a parental figure avenging the killer from the first movie. Again, both films ended in a theater for the last fight. You had in Scream 2, it was a drama theater. In Scream 6, it's a movie theater. In both films, it's set outside of Woodsboro. In Scream 2, it's set at college. In Scream 6, it's set in New York. And that's all the ones I can think of off of the top of my head. But aside from being, Easter eggs where if you've seen both movies, you get what they're doing, it doesn't exactly add substance to the film. They once again seem vaguely aware of this. I mean, the theater that the final fight takes place in was filled with props and costumes from every other Scream, so they're openly saying, look, do you remember all of these things from the other Screams? But aside from pointing out that they know what they're doing, it doesn't add anything more to it than the fact that they're aware that they're doing it. It's still just endless Easter eggs with not much more substance. Scream 2022 really did feel like a Scream movie that maybe Wes Craven would make, but I feel like this movie is the kind of Scream movie that would happen once Wes Craven hung up his gloves because he felt it was getting a bit too derivative. And that probably all sounds very negative, which in a sense it certainly is. Because of it, I would say it is one of the weaker Scream films. But aside from it not being a very good Scream film, it's still a really good slasher. One of the best we've gotten in a very long time. And we don't get many high-budget slashers anymore. That's part of the reason why the Scream franchise is struggling to say anything. But it's just nice to see a good high-budget slasher in the cinema. So there is that. If you're a slasher fan, it's fantastic in that regard. It's well shot, it's moody, it's set during Halloween, which is always a good fun way to squeeze a few more monsters and ghouls into it. And like the other Halloweens, it's still really funny. It's no longer really clever, but it is still a lot of good laughs. Like, we laughed out loud several times throughout the film. So there is that. If you're looking for a slasher movie and you can't watch Friday the 13th because they don't make them anymore, and you want a good laugh with a good bit of gore, it's a great movie for that. It's just not a great Scream movie. There were some super dumb moments, which I would be remiss in not pointing out. For instance, after Tara and her sister were threatened to be killed and already 2 people had been murdered, they told the police they were going to flee town, and the police said, "No, I'm sorry, you're suspects, you can't leave the city." Which is fair enough, but give them a police escort. Like, they are known targets, even if they're also suspects. And you could say the reason that didn't happen is because the father, the police officer, was the killer and wanted them to be still easily accessible by the killer. But the FBI agent, Kirby, was still there also. She should have insisted that they need a police escort, police protection of some sort. And even if it was to be denied, it's just weird that neither Tara nor her sister requested it themselves. Like, if I had someone that had just threatened to kill me, and someone who had just tried to kill me in a convenience store, and the police told me I couldn't leave town, I would immediately be asking for a police escort. Like, no hesitation. But it wasn't even brought up to be denied, which is not the best script writing. Another bit of a weird thing, also excusable sort of because the police officer father who was the killer recommended it, but once again bad script writing that none of the other characters took issue with it. While they're going on their way to the theater for the final confrontation to try to trap Ghostface, the cop just tells them, take public transport, it'll be safer than being alone. And me and my friend, when they said that in the cinema, were both like, what? Like, are you telling me that a crowded subway train on Halloween, full of people wearing masks, is going to be safer than catching an Uber or a taxi? And, it turns out, no, it's not safer. One of them gets stabbed. And once again, you can somewhat excuse it by being like, well, the cop father was in on the plan. But it's just weird that not a single character was like, oh, that's actually a terrible plan. We should not be taking a crowded subway after we've been attacked, in public before even, by this killer. Take a taxi, man. Then, finally, I thought it was funny that Chad was in this film, because I was sure he had been killed in the first movie. But it just turns out he was stabbed a bunch of times and left for dead, and he's fine. Which became an on-running theme in Scream 6. Like, everyone, and I mean everyone, gets stabbed just so many times, and they're fine. They're all fine. Death isn't a thing. I'm pretty sure that the Australian girl that got stabbed in the alleyway at the start is probably fine. She'll be in the next movie. Hell, at this point, I wouldn't be surprised if the dismembered dude that was in the refrigerator makes a reappearance and is just fine and dandy. Because you don't get killed by being stabbed a bunch in this universe anymore, apparently. The most egregious example of this was definitely at the end of the movie. Jenna Ortega's character, Tara, she gets stabbed in, like, the gut. And then she finishes the fight and the bad guy's killed. And then her and her sister are just sitting there in the theater joking about how they're going to need so much therapy. Then they go outside and many other characters are getting wheeled away on hospital beds and they're all fine and giving thumbs up. and they say their piece to the police and walk off into the sunset together as if they're not bleeding to death. Like, I feel like the screenwriter just forgot that Jenna Ortega had been stabbed in the gut. That's gonna need stitches, man. You can't just walk off into the sunset. But regardless, that is Scream 6. I think history will remember it as possibly the official point in the franchise where it got a lot dumber and a lot more generic. But as I said, on the bright side, it's still a very fun slasher film installment that we're apparently just going to get every year now until the end of time, like we used to for the Friday the 13th franchise. And even though it's become that which it had been created to parody, I'm still looking forward to the next installment. I no longer expect it to be smart or witty, but I'm still sure it's going to be exciting and a lot of fun, and that's just fine. Though I do admit, during the entire film, I just had a little voice in the back of my head, quoting Scream 2022, a line that I believe the killer says, which was, "You can't have a bona fide Halloween movie without Jamie Lee." And, this is a Scream movie without Sidney Prescott, and it really did feel like the least Scream a Scream movie has been, perhaps ever. So maybe that's an example of practicing what you preach. I know there were issues getting Neville Campbell back for this film because they didn't want to pay her the amount she wanted, but hopefully they recant on that and we see her in Scream 7 and it turns it around a little. But regardless, thank you for listening. I am Pat Dennis, and you've been tuned into Creative Elk's Theatre of Thrills podcast. I'll see you next time.